We are all carrying around these pocket computers that are internet connected, that have incredible cameras on top of them with GPS chips activated. And I think we're entering an interesting time of pervasive mapping, when everyone has access to location information and the ability to contribute that back into the whole.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Jonathan Neufeld. He is the CEO of a company called Tekterra. So Tekterra focuses on helping companies develop and commercialize geospatial technology. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about his work, the trends he sees in the industry at the moment in terms of business plans focused around geospatial technology, and we're also going to talk about an idea of a one-to-one map and what that might mean. So stick around, it's a really interesting conversation. If you're new here and haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. This is a weekly podcast, so next week there'll be another one coming out, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. Also, if you could do me a huge favor and share this with a friend. If you know someone who might enjoy this kind of content, I would really appreciate it if you would share this with them. Okay, let's get into the interview. John, welcome to the podcast. You are the CEO of a company called Tekterra. This is a geospatial podcast, so Tekterra has something to do with geospatial and the geospatial industry, and I'd like to talk about that in just a minute. But before we actually dive into that side of the conversation, perhaps you could take the time to introduce yourself and your geospatial background to the listeners.
Yeah, you bet, Daniel. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here today. I'm the leader of Tekterra. We're based here in Calgary, but I've had a pretty good career in geospatial before I ended up here. I've got a background in geomatics engineering from the University of Calgary, and I spent quite a few years traveling around with aerial photo crews doing aerial surveys, both in photo and radar, all across North America, and had the good fortune to spend some time in Europe and Asia doing that as well. So I've seen many different facets of the geospatial industry, and excited now to be leading it in a new forward-looking direction.
Okay, so maybe we could dive into what Tekterra is for a company. What does it do?
Yeah, absolutely. We are a government-funded nonprofit based here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. The main thing that we focus on is helping companies develop and commercialize innovative geospatial technologies. What we really want to see is companies take a risk on building something new that they might not have otherwise been able to do, develop a new technology, and then get it out into the market. It's exciting to see those new technologies flourish and grow, and it's exciting to see companies being created and growing and employing new people and really adding to the economy here in Alberta.
So I'm curious why Alberta decided to create a company like this or an organization like this and focus specifically on geospatial. Is this part of a plethora of other organizations that they're sort of wanting to get out there in the world? Or was there a reason why geospatial was important to focus on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Alberta has been a leader in geospatial for quite some time. The University of Calgary here was one of the first universities to have a department of geomatics engineering, and for a long time was one of only two in Canada that offered that. Those have since grown, obviously. But Tekterra was set up because geomatics was recognized as an area in which Alberta could be a leader, and also an area of strategic importance when looking at both the resource sectors and the growing technology economy as a whole.
Okay, so that makes good sense there, given the background that Alberta has in the geospatial industry and spatial education. So I'm assuming when you're the CEO of a company like this, you see a lot of interesting projects, a lot of interesting business cases. What makes a great business case in terms of geospatial? Is it deciding to use a particular platform or focusing on a particular industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are very much interested in pushing the boundaries of science and technology, but also staying grounded and solving real problems with real customers who are going to pay you real money to solve that problem. We tend to see companies across a whole spectrum, right? So the best ones know exactly which problem they're solving. They know exactly who their customer is and what problem that customer needs solved. It's a bit redundant to say that twice, but that's a key thing. Because if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, it becomes impossible to sell it to anyone. And then on top of that business piece, we're looking for innovation, and particularly innovation within geomatics, right? So the more novel it is, the more interesting it is, and the more it's pushing the boundaries of what's possible today, the more interested we are because we think it has a better opportunity.
So there's a lot of really interesting points there. So we're talking about pushing the boundaries, but at the same time we're talking about solving very real problems. So how do you distinguish between a great idea and a fad, or something that's just a flash in the pan, or perhaps just a crazy idea? What makes the difference there between innovation and a dumb idea?
Yeah, you've hit on something really interesting, because I think if you look at really innovative ideas, they're almost indistinguishable from the crazy ones. And if you think about our friend Clayton Christensen, who talked about this in The Innovator's Dilemma, the solutions in the early phases often seem completely unrealistic. It might not solve the problem, it might be crazy expensive, it might be an entirely different approach. But over time, you start to see that these things compete on a different vector, and they're solving a problem in a unique way, or in fact, creating new market opportunities. Now, sometimes it's just a bad idea, or it's just a technology looking for a problem. And we've seen our fair share of those too. Those are pretty quick to identify because they have the technology fully fleshed out. They think they know who they're going to sell it to, but it's very clear that that potential customer won't actually pay the money for that solution. So I find it can become clear as you dig into who the company is working with and what that specific problem is.
Could you maybe give us some ideas of solutions where you knew straight away this is not going to work? You don't have to name any names, but perhaps just give us a sort of broad overview of a solution or a company or a business case we think, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, some of my favorite ones are just spectacularly complex. You know, they've identified a small problem or a simple problem that the customer has and gone on to create this whole complex piece of machinery and technology to try and solve this very simple problem. And it's obvious that they're looking to apply what they've got to this simple thing, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. The other one I love is where they've completely misrepresented the market. And they've got a technology, they've identified the problem, and you ask them, all right, in 3 to 5 years, how much money do you think you'll make off of this? We've had companies tell us they're going to make $500 million in the next 5 years off a specific technology. And while I appreciate the grandeur that they're looking at, it's just not really realistic that they're going to go after typically a small market and capture that much value in such a short period of time. Those ones are just completely out of the ballpark.
I'm curious to know. So this is a geospatial podcast. We talk about geospatial location intelligence, that kind of thing here. So I'm wondering, these companies that you work with, the ones that you decide have a shot at being successful, do they market themselves as being geospatial companies? Are they going out into the marketplace and saying, hey, we have a location intelligence solution we have to your spatial problem?
Not very often, honestly. You and I were both geospatial people. We've built our careers, we've built our experiences in the geospatial domain, and I suspect many of the listeners have too. But when these companies are going out and solving problems, they don't see it from that point of view. We see that as the key piece because that's what we've been trained towards. But for the technology providers and for the customers, what they're often more interested in is things like operational efficiency, reducing risk, increasing safety, increasing performance. It's those sorts of somewhat mundane business objectives that really are driving it. In a lot of cases, they don't really care what's happening behind the scenes. They just want their problem solved. It just so happens that geospatial is the best way to solve those particular problems.
Yeah, I think you gave some really, really good insights there. I want to take this a step further. I realize that you're mostly dealing with businesses, but I think that you might have some insights for geospatial professionals. Do you think they could learn something from the approach that these companies that you work with are using in terms of their marketing strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime you're going out and trying to help a person with a problem, and let's face it, selling is a personal thing, right? I'm a human, you're a human. We're trying to connect on that level. It's worth paying attention to the specific problem and the specific outcomes that person is driving towards. And then, being able to communicate with them how you can attach and solve that problem for them, right? So We've funded companies where they're all about efficiency, and they're all about helping manufacturers of particularly large things like automobiles, helping large auto manufacturers be more efficient in their assembly lines. Now, they do this through indoor location technology at a super precise level, but the auto manufacturer probably doesn't really care how that device works or the specific technology behind it. What they know is it gives them an X% increase on their throughput and their quality, and that's what they're after.
Which makes perfect sense. So if I could try and summarize that here, what I hear you say, or what I'm getting out of that last sentence there, was that as geospatial professionals, people working in the industry, perhaps we should have a little bit more empathy for the people that we're trying to serve, put ourselves in their position, what problems are they trying to solve, and perhaps not talk about the technology so much, but the solutions. How are we going to move them forwards?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, ask an average person what type of processor is in their smartphone, and they wouldn't be able to tell you, right? They don't care. But what they do care is that their phone is fast and that it boots up quickly, that it does what they need to, that it has the power to process their images and their text messages. But they don't really care what kind of chip is back there making it happen. So think about who's on the other end of your device or your system or your process. And then what do they really need out of it? And I think the other piece of advice I would offer to people in the geospatial industry is that more and more maps are not necessarily the output that your client wants, right? If you think about land use analysis or road design or even satellite imaging, in a lot of cases, the client isn't interested in 7 hard drives full of pretty pictures. What they want to know is, how busy are those parking lots? What do the crops look like this year? Are my sworn enemies moving tanks into position that I need to be aware of? And they don't want to have to sift through that whole stack of hard drives and look at all those pretty pictures. They just want the intelligence that comes out of it.
I think that's a really interesting insight there, because I think people that start off in GIS, for example, there was such a strong focus on the map, the visual output, and which is great, of course, because maps can show so much information in one picture. But I think that's really interesting that you said that there's more focus on, just tell me the answer. What is the answer to the question? And I'm imagining anyway, could you please make the process repeatable so we can check the answer again tomorrow and the day after?
That's right. And I think, as geospatial people, we love the map. I love maps. I tend to take them hiking with me in hard copy. It's the first app I open on my phone. But not everyone is like that, right? And what they want to know is the specific answer. How close is this restaurant? How do I get there? And then how do I get there over and over and over again? I think what that gives us, though, is an opportunity to move ourselves up the value chain and think about the ways in which we as location professionals are adding value to our customers and our clients, right? We can provide that insight. We can provide that detailed knowledge. We can provide the high level technical background to make those sorts of solutions possible and making it really, really easy for them. And I think there's a lot of value in that because it's very hard to get to simplicity, but when you do, it's incredibly powerful.
So right at the start of the conversation, we talked a lot about innovation, and this is a word that we hear again and again. Innovation. It's the thing that's going to drive us forward. It's going to solve the problems in the future. But I'm curious now, because you deal with a lot of innovative companies, how do they overcome that if it isn't broken, don't fix it? What are they doing that's helping move people forward and to move to these new solutions that they're offering?
Yeah, so I think the trick is understanding the notion between something being broken and something being an opportunity, right? So one of the companies we've worked with lately reads meter information. So the gas meter, the electricity meter, those devices on people's houses, they have a novel way of reading those meters. And in the past, the utility companies would pay someone to drive around and walk into everyone's backyard and look at the number on the dial and write the number down. And then that evolved to systems where they could drive around and collect that information. And the company we're working with now has a system where they can fly in an aircraft and collect that information. So the system before was working fine, right? They were getting the knowledge, they were getting the meters, they were billing their clients, everyone was relatively happy. But it cost a lot of money and it was relatively dangerous. Everyone believes driving cars to be quite safe, and it's reasonably safe. But you log that many miles, you're bound to have some incidents. With an aircraft, they can collect entire cities in a matter of days, it's remarkably cost effective. So here's an example where something wasn't really broken per se, but there was sure a lot of room to improve it. And when they were able to demonstrate to the executives, look, our system can save you money and time and safety and add on nice things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that becomes a very easy sell.
So again, we're back to the idea of selling in. We're back to the idea of demonstrating, that we have a solution that works and that there's a business case behind that. And of course, all this can be wrapped up in communication. And this is something I think that we could all improve on. Who is our target audience? What message do they need to hear? And how am I going to get that to them in the most efficient way? So I'd like to move off now and talk a little bit about some of the trends that you see in the industry, because again, you're working with a lot of different companies, and I guess you have the opportunity to sort of see what's working and what's not working, and where people are focusing their energy right now.
Yeah, we're seeing a couple of interesting trends coming out, and I think it's an interesting confluence of the time as well. So we're seeing a bit of a backlash on privacy. We have a popular coffee chain here in Canada called Tim Hortons, and they somewhat recently moved their points programs to an app. But a reporter from the Financial Times did an expose that said this app was pinging your location, something like every 5 minutes, even when you weren't using it. And it was even recording things like every time you went into a Starbucks or a competitor. And it was feeding all of that back to the big brand that owns Tim Hortons. And for most people, when they go on and they engage that app and they say, yes, you can use my location so I can find the nearest store, they haven't in the past been thinking about all the consequences of that information. But we're seeing a trend now where people are becoming more and more privacy conscious and more aware of those sorts of transgressions. I should say the company has now disabled, or has claimed to have disabled, that tracking, and they are under investigation by some ethics watchdogs here in Canada. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But I believe that privacy is becoming an area for innovation as more and more people begin to understand what the implications of it. And then on the flip side, we are all carrying around these pocket computers that are internet connected, that have incredible cameras on top of them with GPS chips activated. And I think we're entering an interesting time of pervasive mapping, when everyone has access to location information and the ability to contribute that back into the whole.
So when you think about pervasive mapping, are we talking about something like OpenStreetMap, or do you have a bigger vision in mind?
So I think OpenStreetMap is the one that kind of blew it open and demonstrated that the community is willing to contribute information to the map. And I think if I take that to its next logical conclusion, we are approaching a time when we will have hyper-accurate knowledge and information of location, which will allow us to build a one-to-one scale map.
Wow. Okay. So a one-to-one, we've got to talk about this a little bit more, because just the idea of a one-to-one map is fantastic. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the technology trigger. In this case, it's the internet, it's connectivity, and it's cell phones in our pockets. What is the cultural trigger here? Why do you think that people are going to want to build this map and contribute to it and maintain it?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a really good question. So we live in an age now where everything is customizable. Everything can be adapted to our individuality, can suit us, and can fit the world in which we personally inhabit, right? If I think about Google, it is so good because it knows everything about me. It has 10 years of email to mine and know what I want and like and look for. And therefore, the search results can be perfectly tailored to what it thinks I want. If you think spatially, we now have the power to contribute data to the map, and then also to change what we see on a digital map. I want to say a one-to-one map kind of sounds absurd on its face, because if you think about any previous era, you're thinking about a physical document. And if I was to go hiking with a one-to-one map, it would be absolutely absurd. You wouldn't be able to store it anywhere, and it certainly would be of no use. But in a digital realm, we can capture the information from smartphones, from IoT devices, from all these intelligent cars driving around, from satellites, from building sensors. And we can begin to put this into a place where we have a perfect, clear picture of the world in its digital format. And we can roll out this one-to-one map in a digital format.
So I think it's one thing to capture the physical world, which would be a massive undertaking in itself. How do you think we would be able to capture the cultural world?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I tend to use Strava. I'm a cyclist and a runner, and I love Strava for tracking my physical activities. And I think it's interesting to look at the Strava activity layer, because if you look at a popular park here in Calgary called North Glenmore, you can very easily see the trails and the pathways and the roads that are used by hikers and bikers. But if you look, there's also a perfect oblong oval shape out in the middle of the water. And that's not something you would get from the physical geography, right? It's not hills and valleys and pavement, but that's people who are training for rowing, right? They're out there rowing around, getting their physical exercise and tracking that through the Strava app. So what we're seeing now is a psychological, social layer to the map. Not only what is, but how is, right? Before, we were most interested in the physical geography of things, but in this digital era and the one-to-one map era, we can begin to layer on how we use spaces. And I think eventually that'll even get us to why we use spaces.
Yeah, so that of course leads me into my next question, because this is a fantastic thought experiment, or I'm sure it's on the way. Someone will be working on this somewhere. So let's assume we have made this. We've got a one-to-one map, and it perfectly represents the physical world and the social world, the cultural world. What do you think? What kind of problems could we solve with this?
Mm-hmm. That's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've got some answers, which I'll share in a moment, but I want to put a caveat on there to say I'm not quite sure we know what all is going to be capable with that sort of technology and that sort of information. And often I find those sorts of data and layers lead to new outcomes that we could not have imagined. But, sitting here today, I'm thinking about things like active transportation, right? So I mentioned that I'm a cyclist, and personally, I would love to see many more bike lanes through our city here in Calgary. And if we knew very accurately how and when both pedestrians and cyclists were using the space, I think it would be very interesting to contrast that with how people in vehicles were using the space. And could we readjust the way that we've laid out our city? If we understand the kind of trips people take, is it within 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers, 20 kilometers? Could we readjust the way that our cities are laid out? Rather than having housing suburbs all by themselves, could we have them, more built up with other types of amenities? And then could we even understand how, reflecting on the Black Lives Matter protests, could we even understand how the history of a place is coming into effect in the modern day era, right? How are the monuments and the places and the things that happened in the past, how do they affect our current life? And how do we, honor that? How do we move on from that? And how do we begin to understand what we can do to reshape people's lives to be the best possible lives they can be in any given place?
So when I hear you talk about those things, one of the most powerful things for me is the idea of this perfect context, right? So I'd have context to everything. It wouldn't just be my commute in the morning on the way to work, or the route I take when I cycle home again, or the walk that I did last Tuesday. It would be the context that all this was happening in, represented in a one-to-one version of the world. So I could see the social context that it was happening in. I could see the physical context, and it would also be relative to everybody else. And I think that would be absolutely fantastic.
Exactly. That's exactly it, right? Understanding not only where we are and what we're doing there, but then why? Why do I go walking in the evening? And how does that impact my quality of life? How can others begin to cycle to work like you do? How can we access markets? And what does that mean for the people who live in our cities and our communities? It's a fascinating question. And I think having that context and that contextual understanding of society in that geospatial way will lead to many positive outcomes.
Yeah, but I can see a flip side to this. And we talked a little bit about privacy before, and I think that would be a massive issue with something like this.
Yeah, I agree. And that's admittedly one part of this experiment that I haven't fully thought through. If we live in a world where we have pervasive geospatial understanding, does that mean every time I leave my kitchen and walk to the bathroom? Does that mean that every time I go to someone else's house or someone else's shop? And how do we respect people's privacy while still desiring to understand that deeper question of why. I've seen some interesting blogs and articles lately around how you really cannot anonymize location-based information. There was some good reporting out of the New York Times back in December of 2019 about this, how they were able to track individual cell phones from the Pentagon back to the residence where that individual employee worked. And I think about my situation. There's only one person who works at my office and lives at my house, and it becomes very obvious then to connect all of those privacy dots. So I don't have an answer to that question. And I think as we move forward into this era, we absolutely must bake in privacy from the very beginning, because if we don't do that, it will lead to much bigger problems than the benefits we get from it.
We touched on this a little bit before, and we talked about privacy actually being an opportunity, because whenever there's a challenge, right, there's also an opportunity. And because if we go back to an example of the one-to-one map of the world, I mean, there would be such incredible amounts of opportunity with that data set, with that representation of the world, that people are going to work very, very hard, I would imagine, to solve some of these challenges around privacy, for example.
I agree. I think it opens up a tremendous avenue of opportunity for companies to exploit and to launch themselves into. I don't know the specific problem yet, right? I don't know that specific problem or who is going to pay for it. But I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore, to know how we can protect people's privacy and their rights while still understanding our world at that next deeper level.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to sort of move away from our one-to-one map talk now and concentrate on things that are a little bit more closer to home. So I wonder if it's okay with you, I'll ask some quick-fire questions, and I'd just really like to hear your insights on these questions.
Yeah, fire away.
Okay, so you're a person who sees a lot of interesting use cases, a lot of interesting business cases in the geospatial industry. If you had to look at the industry as a whole, what is it that we should stop doing?
Stop trying to sell geospatial and start understanding what people actually want.
And so this question sort of follows on from the first one. What is it that we should be doing much more of?
I think we should be thinking more in the 3 to 5 year time frame and building out for that positive future rather than hanging on to the past.
Okay, and when you say that, are you thinking about our approach to solving problems? Are you thinking about the tools that we're using or the platforms that we're utilizing?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the tools that we're using and even the mentality that we bring to it. If we keep building things and technologies and solutions and GIS departments and academics in the way that we have for the last 50 years, we'll get another 50 years like we've just had. But if we think about what pervasive location intelligence can mean, and if we think about the benefits afforded by miniaturized sensors and unmanned drones and incredible satellite technology, I think we have an opportunity to build an incredible future in location understanding.
When you think about the future for GIS professionals as we know it today, what do you think about? Where are the opportunities? What should we be thinking about doing?
So first of all, I would suggest every GIS professional go do a couple courses in communication and understanding what their bosses or clients are looking for. And then I would say, lean into your specialty, right? People in the GIS field have a deep understanding of very specific things that is not replicated somewhere else. And I love Google Maps for everything it did for our industry to bring awareness in the general public. But there's so many issues around accuracy and specificity and datums and data types and all of that where GIS professionals really excel. So lean into that, but communicate the top line value that you're bringing to the client you're working with.
John, I really want to thank you for your time. Thank you for this enlightening conversation. Thank you for your insights into the industry. Just before I let you go, where can the listeners go if they want to connect with you or if they want to continue the conversation?
You bet. You can find us at techterra.com, TECTERRA, or you can find me at Twitter at John_Neufeld.
I'll be sure to put links to those places in the show notes. Thanks again, John. I've really appreciated it.
Thank you, Daniel. It was great to be here.
And that's it for this episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel. It's been a pleasure being your host again this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back again next week with another podcast episode, so look out for that. They usually go live on Wednesdays. So keep an eye out for that. And I also want to remind you that all the links and the resources mentioned in each podcast episode are available at mapscaping.com. So head on over there if you're interested in that. Okay, that's it from me. We'll talk again next week. Bye.